She had billions at the bank, an empire built floor by floor, and security teams on every level. But when her 8-year-old daughter was found broken and barely breathing in a restricted underground corridor, Serena Hawthorne ran past all of them, straight to the man pushing a mop. Because the quiet janitor who worked nights and kept his head down was hiding something no one at Veyron Dynamics had ever suspected. And whatever he had buried inside that uniform, whatever he had walked away from, her daughter needed it right now. If you've never seen a story like this one, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and don't go anywhere. Drop your city and country in the comments right now so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, and I believe it will, leave a like before this episode ends. Let's begin. The lobby of Veyron Dynamics at 11:15 on a Tuesday night was the kind of quiet that only existed after the last associate had badged out, and the cleaning crew had divided the floors among themselves. The marble floors caught the overhead light at a low angle and threw it back pale and cold. Security cameras blinked their slow red pulses at the corners. The building breathed differently at night, not the pressurized hum of ambition and competing schedules, but something slower, almost mechanical. Owen Strickland had worked this shift for 2 years and 4 months, and he knew the building's nighttime rhythms the way some men knew their own kitchens. Which elevator made that particular grinding sound on the descent from the 14th floor? Which stretch of corridor near the executive wing held a draft that came through a badly sealed maintenance panel? Which security guard, on which rotation, stopped to refill his coffee at exactly 9:53? He was 45 minutes into mopping the east corridor of the second floor when his radio crackled. Not his radio exactly, but the one clipped to the belt of Marco, the overnight security supervisor, who was 12 feet behind him talking fast and low into the receiver. Owen kept his mop moving. He had learned early that the best thing a night janitor could do in a building full of people who didn't see him was to make sure they kept not seeing him. He was good at it. After the years he'd spent learning to disappear into environments far more hostile than a corporate building, a marble corridor with fluorescent lighting was almost restful. He heard fragments, restricted corridor, underground level, a child. The mop stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he's hearing something and needs to make absolutely certain he's heard it correctly before he does anything at all. She's breathing, but it's bad. Medical already called. Owen set the mop carefully against the wall. He was still standing there, hand resting on the handle, when the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened and Serena Hawthorne came through it at a speed that wasn't quite running, but wasn't anything else either. She was still in the clothes she'd worn to the board meeting that had run 4 hours over schedule, charcoal blazer, heels that clicked hard against the marble, and her face was a controlled terror that only people trained to perform composure under pressure ever managed. The composure was failing. He could see it at the edges. He had seen that particular expression before, not in boardrooms. She saw him at the same moment he turned. She crossed the distance between them in seconds and grabbed the front of his uniform with both hands. Not gently, not tentatively. She grabbed him the way people grab things when they've run out of options, and the world has narrowed to a single point. Owen. Her voice broke on the second syllable. They hurt my daughter. She can't hold on much longer. I need you, please. He looked at her hands on his uniform. He looked at her face. Where? He said. Underground level. Restricted corridor B. Security found her. They called someone, I don't know. She's barely... How long has she been down there? Maybe 20 minutes before they found her. I don't know. Is she conscious? Serena's jaw tightened. She was. She kept asking for me and then she stopped asking. Owen reached back without looking and unclipped the radio from his own belt. The building services frequency, not security's, and held it out toward Marco, who had come up behind Serena. Tell your people to clear the elevator and hold it at the underground level, Owen said. Not a request. And get me a first aid kit, not the standard cabinet one. The trauma kit from the security station on the first floor, the red case. Marco blinked. I'm sorry. Are you? The red case. Owen was already moving. Now. The elevator ride lasted 43 seconds. Owen counted them without thinking about it, the same way he'd once counted the seconds of a controlled descent in near-total darkness with 60 pounds of gear on his back and 2 wounded men depending on whether he remembered his training or panicked. He didn't look at Serena during the ride. He was already running through the variables. what a child's airway looked like when compromised, the weight differential, the positioning, the improvised options if the trauma kit arrived incomplete. He was cataloging what he knew and what he didn't know yet, and the space in his chest that had been quiet for 2 years and 4 months was doing something uncomfortable. Serena stood beside him, gripping her own forearm with one hand. Her knuckles were white. "She's 8, she said. She wasn't talking to him exactly. She was saying it to the air, or to herself, or to something. "She's 8 years old, and she came with me to the office because her after-school program ended early, and I told her she could sit in the conference room and do her homework, and I would be done in an hour." "What's her name?" Owen said. Serena looked at him. "Chloe." "Okay." He said it quietly, without inflection, because he needed her to understand it was acknowledgement, not reassurance. He wasn't going to tell her everything was fine. He had no idea yet whether everything was fine. The elevator opened. The restricted underground corridor smelled like concrete and electrical conduit, and something that was probably the copper-heavy wrongness of fresh blood, though there wasn't much of it. 3 security officers were crouched in a cluster near the far wall, and between their bodies Owen could see the small shape of a child on the floor, and his jaw set hard and he moved. "Back up," he said. Not loudly, but the officers moved. Chloe Hawthorne was lying on her side, which was the right instinct from whoever had found her, keep an unconscious child off her back. But her position wasn't quite right, and her breathing, when Owen crouched beside her and put his face close to listen, had developed the specific quality that meant her airway was under some kind of stress, not blocked, compromised. The difference mattered. She was pale. Her left arm was clearly injured, held at an angle that suggested she'd tried to catch herself or been grabbed roughly. And there was a cut above her eyebrow that had bled significantly, but had partially clotted. Her pulse, when Owen pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat, was there, present, but light. Too light for his comfort. "Chloe." He didn't raise his voice. He put his hand against her cheek, just enough pressure to register through whatever fog she was in. "My name is Owen. Your mom's right here. I need you to stay with me." A sound from her. Not words, but something. Behind him, Serena made a noise that she immediately swallowed. Owen looked back at one of the security officers. "You! Get down here. I need you to hold her head exactly like this." He demonstrated the angle. "And keep it there. Don't let it drop forward. Don't tilt it back. Exactly like this. Can you do that?" The officer, a woman in her 30s, nodded and moved into position without argument. Owen stood and turned to another officer. "Where's the red case?" "Coming down now, Chet. Tell them to run." He turned back to Chloe and began the assessment he'd been trained to do in darkness, in noise, in chaos, in situations that made an underground corridor in a corporate building look like a sterile operating room. He checked her pupils with the flashlight from his pocket. Uneven dilation, which told him something he filed away immediately. He checked her rib cage, running his hands along the sides with a pressure that was firm enough to be diagnostic without being rough, looking for the way she responded, whether she flinched, whether her breathing changed. Serena was on her knees on the other side of Chloe, one hand resting near her daughter's hand without quite touching it. Owen noticed that, the way Serena had trained herself to stay out of the way, even when every instinct she had was screaming in the opposite direction. It was an extraordinary act of self-control from a woman who was barely holding herself together, and he filed that away too. "She's going to need a hospital," he said without looking up. "She already needs one. But right now her airway is the priority, and I need her to get through the next 15 minutes stable before the paramedics arrive and we can move her safely." "What does that mean? 15 minutes? "It means we do our job here and let them do their job when they arrive." "Is she going to—" "I don't know yet." He looked up at Serena for the first time since they'd crouched down. "I'm not going to tell you something I don't know. What I can tell you is she's fighting, and I'm not going to let her stop." The red case arrived. Owen opened it on the floor beside him, and the security officer who'd carried it down watched with an expression of bewildered confusion as the janitor sorted through the contents with the practiced efficiency of a man who had cataloged trauma kits in worse light than this, in worse circumstances than this, with hands that had been steadier and hands that had been less steady, and who knew without hesitation what he needed and in what order. He worked. The corridor was quiet except for Chloe's breathing and the distant sound of the elevator, and once, Serena saying her daughter's name in a voice so stripped of everything else that it barely sounded like language. 12 minutes later, the paramedics came through the corridor and entrance at a controlled jog, and the team leader, a compact man in his 40s named Reyes, who had been doing this for 16 years, crouched beside Owen and spent approximately 8 seconds assessing what was in front of him before he looked up. "Who stabilized her?" "I did," Owen said, already stepping back to give the team room. Reyes looked at him. Really looked at him in the way a professional looks at someone's work and tries to reverse engineer the training behind it. "What's your background?" "Building services," Owen said. Reyes looked at him a second longer, then looked back at Chloe, because Chloe was the priority and the question could wait, but his expression said clearly that he would be asking it again later. The team moved efficiently. Owen stepped further back and stood near the wall, and in the motion of stepping back he caught a glimpse of Marco, the security supervisor, looking at him with an expression that was working through several things at once. Confusion, recognition, something else. Owen had been careful about the tattoo. He wore long sleeves always, even in the building's overheated summer months. But the movement of crouching and working had shifted his sleeve, and the partial design visible at the inside of his left forearm, the one that marked something he'd spent 2 years trying to put carefully in a drawer and close, was showing now. Marco had seen it. Owen pulled his sleeve down without making it a moment. Across the corridor, Serena was talking to one of the paramedics in fast, clipped sentences, giving medical history, allergy information, the name of Chloe's pediatrician. She was organizing herself. It was the only thing she had left to do, so she was doing it with everything she had. And then Chloe's eyes opened. Not fully, not for long, but enough. "Mom," she said. The word came out rough and barely there, like something that had to fight its way through. But it was a word, it was her word, her voice, her 8-year-old self pushing back against whatever had tried to take her tonight. Serena was beside her before the sound had finished. Owen watched from the wall. He felt something in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Not quite relief, not quite grief. Somewhere in the territory between them where parents sometimes lived without knowing it. He thought of Mason, asleep right now at their apartment 3 miles away, in the care of their neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, who watched him on Owen's night shifts without ever asking for more explanation than "I'll be home by 6. He thought about what it would be like to get that call. He thought about it only for a second before he shut the door on it firmly, because he was standing in a corridor where a child had just said her mother's name, and there was no room here for his own fear. The paramedics began preparing to move her. Owen found Serena at his elbow. She wasn't touching his uniform this time. She was standing very close, close enough that he could see the mascara that had tracked partway down one cheek and dried there, and she was looking at him with an expression that had too many things in it to sort out in a hallway. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "Owen, they need the corridor," he said quietly. "Let them work." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and followed her daughter toward the elevator. Owen stood in the emptying corridor for a while after they'd gone. The security officers drifted out. Marco hovered at the edge of the entrance, clearly wanting to say something, and then clearly deciding it could wait, and then disappearing too. The corridor was quiet. Owen bent and began putting the trauma kit back together with the same methodical care he'd used taking it apart. Each item in its place, each latch closed. He was a man who put things away properly. He had learned the hard way what happened when you left the important things where anyone could find them. When the kit was closed and returned to Marco's officer and the corridor was empty, Owen walked back to the elevator. He rode it up to the second floor. He retrieved his mop from where he'd left it against the wall. His hands were steady. He was not entirely steady. But the mop moved in its slow arcs across the marble, and the corridor was quiet, and somewhere across the city his son was sleeping, and the building breathed its nighttime breath around him, and Owen Strickland pressed his mouth into a line and kept moving. He had a shift to finish. Owen finished his shift at 6:17 in the morning, which was 14 minutes later than usual, because he'd had to remop the section of East Corridor that had been tracked through by emergency personnel. He didn't complain about this to anyone, because there was no one to complain to at 6 in the morning in an empty building, and because complaining about it would have required him to acknowledge that the reason the floor needed remopping was the reason it needed remopping, and he wasn't ready to spend time with that thought yet. He changed out of his uniform in the maintenance locker room on the basement level, folded everything, the same way he always folded it, put his street clothes on, and took the service exit to the parking structure where his truck was waiting in the same spot he parked it every night. The truck was 11 years old and had a crack running across the lower corner of the passenger side windshield that he kept telling himself he'd get fixed and kept not getting fixed. Mason had named it Gerald, for reasons Owen had never fully extracted from his 10-year-old son. And at this point, Gerald had been Gerald for long enough that Owen sometimes caught himself calling it that too. He sat in Gerald for 4 minutes without starting the engine. The parking structure was empty at this hour, except for the skeleton overnight staff who'd be leaving on the next shift change. A fluorescent light 2 rows over was doing its slow death flicker, the kind that maintenance had been supposed to fix for 3 weeks. Owen had mentioned it twice. He'd stopped mentioning it after that because it wasn't his department and there was a limit to how much other people's jobs he was willing to do for free. He started the engine. The drive to Mrs. Delgado's apartment took 11 minutes at this hour with no traffic, and Owen made it in 9 because the streets were empty and he drove faster than he usually admitted to. He told himself it was because he wanted to get Mason up and fed before school, which was true. He told himself it wasn't because something in the last 6 hours had shaken loose a feeling he'd spent 2 years packing down, which was less true. Mrs. Delgado answered the door in her housecoat with the small, sharp eyes of a woman who had been awake for an hour and was already on her second coffee. She was 61 and had lived in the building since before Owen had moved in, and she had started watching Mason on night shifts without much discussion beyond, "I'll pay you and don't insult me, bring me tamales on Sundays." They had now established a Sunday tamale tradition that Mason took completely for granted, which Owen thought was probably healthy. "He's still asleep," she said, stepping back from the door. "Don't wake him before 7. He gets mean." "He gets mean regardless," Owen said. "He gets more mean." She looked at Owen with the particular attention she sometimes gave him when she thought he wasn't noticing. "You look like something happened." "Long night." "You always say that." "It's always true." She handed him a mug of coffee without asking if he wanted one, which was one of the things he genuinely appreciated about her. And he stood in her small kitchen and drank it while she sat at her table and worked on a crossword puzzle in silence. They had developed a comfortable arrangement around not needing to fill silences. Owen had come to value that more than he'd expected. At 7:03, he heard the specific creak of the fold-out cot in Mrs. Delgado's second room, and then a series of sounds that announced Mason's approach. Feet hitting the floor wrong, something falling, a muttered objection to whatever had fallen, shuffling steps. Mason appeared in the kitchen doorway in the oversized t-shirt he used as pajamas, and the look of extreme displeasure he wore every morning for approximately the first 15 minutes of consciousness. I was 10 years old and tall for his age and had his mother's eyes, which Owen had mostly made his peace with. Mostly. "Why are you here?" Mason said. "I live here," Owen said. "Different apartment. Good morning." "It's not good yet." "Give it time." Mason located the refrigerator with the accuracy of a heat-seeking system and began excavating it for orange juice. Mrs. Delgado, without looking up from her crossword, said, "There's eggs if you want them." And Mason said, "Yes, please," with the automatic good manners that only appeared around Mrs. Delgado and nowhere else, which Owen had decided not to examine too closely. He drove Mason to school at 7:45, and on the drive Mason told him about a problem he was having with a kid in his math class who kept borrowing his eraser without asking and not giving it back. Owen listened with the portion of his attention that math class eraser problems deserved, which was not a small portion, because in his experience the things that seemed small were sometimes the things that mattered to his son, and he'd learned the hard way not to sort that out before listening. "Have you told him you want it back?" Owen said. "Yeah." "What did he say?" "He said he forgot." "So he forgot. People forget things." "He keeps forgetting." "Maybe you should get 2 erasers," Owen said. Mason looked at him with the expression of a 10-year-old who has just been told something that technically solved the problem while completely missing the point. "That's not... Dad, that's not the thing." "What's the thing?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "He does it because he knows I won't make a big deal about it." Owen glanced at him. "Is that true? That you won't make a big deal?" "I mean, yeah, I don't want to be the guy who makes a big deal." "There's a difference," Owen said carefully, "between making a big deal and just saying what's yours is yours." Mason appeared to think about this with more seriousness than Owen had expected, staring out the passenger window at the morning traffic moving alongside them. Then he said, "Did you eat anything?" "I had coffee. That's not food. It's a food-adjacent substance. Mrs. Delgado says you don't eat enough." "Mrs. Delgado has opinions about everything." "She's usually right," Mason said, with the serene confidence of a child who had identified a reliable authority and intended to deploy it. Owen pulled up in front of the school, and Mason gathered his backpack with the specific chaos of a kid who never quite had everything organized, no matter how much time had been provided. He got the door open, got one foot out, and then paused in the way he sometimes paused, which meant he had something to say that he hadn't gotten to yet. "You okay?" he asked, not looking at Owen, looking at his backpack zipper. "Yeah," Owen said. Mason nodded once, like a confirmation, and got out of the truck. Owen watched him until he was through the school entrance, which he always did without thinking about it, and then pulled back into traffic. He didn't go home immediately. He drove for a while, which was something he did sometimes when the night had left residue he needed to move through before he could sleep. The city was busy at this hour in the way that cities were busy when everyone was trying to get somewhere at the same time, and Owen drove without a specific direction and let the movement do whatever it did. His hands on the wheel were the same hands that had run a trauma assessment on an 8-year-old girl in an underground corridor 7 hours ago. They looked the same as they always looked. He wasn't sure why he'd expected them to look different. He drove past a fire station, past a hospital he'd been to twice with Mason, once for a broken finger, once for an ear infection that had turned into something more complicated, past a park where he and Mason came on weekend mornings when the weather was right, and neither of them had anywhere to be. He drove home and slept for 4 hours and woke up feeling like he'd been pressed flat and then reinflated imprecisely. This was normal. He'd learned to function in the state. He was eating a bowl of cereal at 2 in the afternoon, the kind Mason liked, which Owen had started buying because it was easier than buying 2 kinds of cereal, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring. It rang again. Same number. He picked up on the third call. "Mr. Strickland." The voice was professional, female, and very deliberately calm in the manner of someone who had been managing difficult things all morning and intended to keep managing them. "My name is Diana Chu. I'm the executive assistant to Serena Hawthorne. Ms. Hawthorne would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. She understands if you'd prefer we come to you." Owen put his spoon down. "Is Chloe okay?" A brief pause. "She's stable. She's going to need some recovery time, but the medical team is optimistic." "Good," he said. "Tell Ms. Hawthorne I hope her daughter heals well." "Mr. Strickland, I don't have anything to say that wasn't said last night. You don't need to send anyone." He hung up. He finished his cereal. He washed the bowl. He stared out the kitchen window at the brick wall of the building across the narrow alley for a while, which was not the most inspiring view but had the advantage of containing nothing that required a response. His phone buzzed. A text from the same number. "She's not calling to offer you money. She just wants to talk. You can say no. D. Chu, who is personally asking because Ms. Hawthorne hasn't slept and keeps asking about you." Owen read the message twice. Then he put his phone face down on the counter and went to lie down on the couch, where he lasted approximately 40 minutes before he gave up on sleeping and called the number back. They met at the hospital, which was not what Owen had expected. He had assumed, he wasn't sure what he had assumed. A conference room, maybe, something corporate and controlled, with Diana Chu present and someone from legal in the corner. Instead, Diana Chu met him in the lobby and led him to the 4th floor, and the room she brought him to was a private room that smelled like antiseptic and had a window with a view of a parking structure and a child-sized shape in the hospital bed with various monitoring equipment doing its quiet, continuous work. Serena was sitting in the chair beside the bed. She looked like she had not slept. This was not a figure of speech. She genuinely looked like a person who had been awake for somewhere between 24 and 30 hours and had refused to allow this to matter enough to do anything about it. Her blazer from the night before was gone, replaced with a zip-up pullover that looked like it belonged to someone else, and her hair was back in a rough knot that had nothing to do with how she usually appeared in the photographs Owen had seen of her in the building's lobby displays. She looked, Owen thought, approximately like a person, which was different from how she usually looked. Chloe was asleep. There was a bruise developing along the left side of her face, and her arm was wrapped and immobilized, and her color was better than it had been 6 hours ago in the underground corridor. Owen looked at her for a moment and felt the same unnamed thing in his chest that he'd felt in the corridor, and then he looked at Serena. "Thank you for coming," Serena said. "You said it wasn't about money." "It's not." "Okay." He didn't sit down because she hadn't asked him to sit, and also because something in the room felt like it needed him to be ready to leave if that turned out to be necessary. "What is it about?" Serena looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she looked at Owen with the expression of a woman who had decided to say something directly and was in the process of confirming that decision. "I watched you last night," she said, "in the corridor. I watched what you did and how you did it. Paramedics would have done the same thing." "They would have done something similar," Serena said, "when they arrived. You were there first. And what I'm talking about isn't just the medical piece." She paused. "The way you talked to the security officers. The way you organized the space. The way you told me—" She stopped, recalibrated. "The way you managed me. That's not a first aid certification. That's training I've seen in 2 people in my life, and both of them were former military." Owen didn't say anything. "My security director recognized your tattoo," she continued. "He didn't say anything to me directly. He sent a memo this morning that said, 'I think we may have had a resource we didn't know about.' That was his exact phrasing. A resource." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I didn't ask him to investigate you. I want to be clear about that. I stopped the memo before it went anywhere." "I appreciate that," Owen said. "I'm not trying to expose anything." She met his eyes. "I just want to understand who you are. Because whoever you are, you saved my daughter's life in a basement corridor with a trauma kit and a flashlight, and I'm sitting in this room with her because of that. And She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "I can't just say thank you and send a card." Owen looked at her. He looked at Chloe. He pulled the visitor's chair back from the wall a few feet and sat down in it, which put him at roughly the same level as Serena and meant he was committed to the conversation now. "Chief Petty Officer," he said. "Navy. Combat Search and Rescue, then SEAL Support. 12 years. He said it the way you recited a resume item in a room where the conversation required it, flat and brief. "The medical training was advanced because, in my unit, you didn't always have a corpsman standing next to you when things went wrong. So you learned." Serena was very still. "I left 8 years ago," Owen said. "My wife got sick while I was deployed. By the time I was back stateside, she was—" He stopped. He said the next part carefully. "She died when Mason was 2. He didn't know her. I made sure I would know her because one of us had to." He said that last part more quietly than the rest and didn't particularly look anywhere while he said it. The monitoring equipment beeped its small, regular beep. Chloe shifted slightly in her sleep, which made Serena's hand move automatically toward her and then stop. "After she died," Owen continued, "I had options. Private security, contracting. I had people calling me with numbers that would have been—" He shook his head slightly. "Good numbers. But all of them required travel. Extended absence. Availability on their schedule, not mine." He looked at his hands for a moment. Mason was 2. He'd already lost one parent. I wasn't going to be the kind of father who was gone every time something happened. "So you took the janitor position," Serena said. "It's a good job," Owen said, and he meant it without irony, which seemed to surprise her. "Night shift means I'm home in the mornings. I make breakfast. I take him to school. I'm at pickup when there's something he needs. The pay is—" He made a small gesture with one hand that acknowledged the obvious arithmetic without dwelling on it. "It's enough. We're okay." Serena looked at him for a long moment. "You've been working in my building for over 2 years. 2 years and 4 months. And you've never said anything to anyone about your background. No reason to. People knew your name. I knew your name." She said it like she was still working something out. "You fixed a broken cartwheel on level 3 6 months ago, and someone sent me a note saying the janitor had fixed it before facilities even filed the request." Owen had forgotten about the cartwheel. "The bracket was bent, not broken, just needed leverage. You also—" Serena glanced at a folded piece of paper she had in her lap, which he hadn't noticed until now. "You reorganized the emergency equipment storage on level 7 during a shift in March. The security director noticed because the response time on a minor incident went down by 4 minutes. He thought it was a new protocol. It was just you. The layout made no sense, Owen said. If you're trying to get to a kit quickly, and the room is organized by the date of acquisition rather than frequency of use, someone's going to spend 40 seconds finding the wrong thing. Serena looked at him with an expression he didn't immediately know what to do with. It wasn't quite admiration, and it wasn't quite frustration, and it had something in it that he recognized, distantly, as the look people sometimes got when they had been holding an assumption about something for a long time, and the assumption had just turned out to be wrong. "Why did you hide it?" she said, and then more precisely, "Why are you still hiding it?" Owen thought about this. He thought about the ways he could answer it, the clean version, the version that would make sense in a hospital room to a billionaire who had almost lost her daughter last night, the version that was easiest to say. He thought about all of those versions and then said the actual one instead. "Because the moment people know what you can do," he said, "they stop seeing who you are. And what I am right now is Mason's father. That's the job. That's the one I can't afford to lose." The room was quiet. Chloe made a small sound in her sleep. Not distress, just the particular sound of a child moving through a dream, and Serena turned toward her with the automatic precision of a parent who has been listening for that sound across every possible distraction. She checked the monitoring readouts. She adjusted the blanket slightly. She did all of this without thinking about it. The muscle memory of a mother, and Owen watched it happen and thought about Mason at 2 years old, and the months after the funeral when he hadn't known what he was doing and had done it anyway because the alternative was not doing it. "The security director's memo," he said. "You said you stopped it." "I did." "I'd like it to stay stopped." "It will." She said it without hesitation and with the specificity of someone making a promise, not a reassurance. "I want to be clear about something, Owen." She'd used his first name twice now, which was something he noted. "I'm not sitting here because I want to expose you or leverage you or add you to some asset list. My daughter is alive because you were in the right place, and you didn't stand still when you heard something was wrong." Her voice went carefully level on the last part. "I'm sitting here because I didn't know who you were, and that means I didn't know what I had, and that matters to me. Not as a business matter, as a personal accounting." Owen looked at her. "A personal accounting?" "I've been running this company since I was 28, she said. "I'm very good at knowing what I have and where it is and how to protect it. I walked past you in the corridor of my own building for 2 years, and I thought you were—" She stopped. "The janitor," Owen said. "Yes. I am the janitor," he said. "That's not an insult to either of us." "No," she said. "I know, that's—" She paused. "That's actually the part I'm having trouble with. Not that I underestimated you, that's humbling, and I can live with that. It's that while I was looking past you, you were paying attention. You knew the building better than my security team. You reorganized equipment storage because you noticed an inefficiency. You were—" She stopped. "You were doing your job with a level of care and precision that most of the people I pay 10 times your salary can't manage, and nobody knew." "I knew," Owen said. She looked at him. "It's enough," he said. "That I know." And then, because she looked like she was about to say something he wasn't sure he was ready to sit with, "How's her arm?" The subject change was visible enough that Serena noticed it and chose to accept it. She looked at Chloe. "Clean fracture. They said it last night. She's going to be in a cast for about 6 weeks and she's going to hate it because she was supposed to start swim lessons in the fall." A pause. "She's been asking about swim lessons since January." "She'll swim," Owen said. 6 weeks is 6 weeks. "Yes." Serena's voice was quieter now. "Yes, it is." They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised Owen somewhat. He was not generally a person who found hospital room silences with billionaires. He barely knew to be comfortable, but something about the exhaustion and the previous night and the specific quality of the light through the parking structure window made it manageable, made it almost ordinary. "The investigation," he said after a while. "Into who did this." Serena's expression changed. Something closed off. Something harder came in. "The police are involved. Corporate security is involved. We know it wasn't random." "I know it wasn't random," Owen said. The injury pattern wasn't right for a panicked grab. Someone had a specific plan, and the plan changed when Chloe reacted more than they expected. He said it clinically because the clinical version was the one he could say in this room without the other version getting in the way. Whoever set this up had access to your schedule. Your personal schedule, not the corporate calendar. Serena was very still. Yes, that's what the investigators are saying. That narrows it considerably. Yes, she said again. It does. She looked at him with the same expression she'd had in the corridor when she'd grabbed his uniform. Not fear this time. Something more deliberate than fear. Something that was beginning to form itself into a question she wasn't quite ready to ask yet. Owen stood. I should go. Mason gets out at 3:15. Serena stood too, automatically. Owen. She stopped him with his name rather than his arm this time. The investigation. If you see anything at the building, anything that doesn't sit right. I see plenty of things that don't sit right, he said. I always have. I know. She held his gaze. That's why I'm asking. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the folder of information that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the corridor. The injury pattern, the deliberate nature of the access, the way certain pieces didn't align the way they were supposed to. He thought about the part of himself that had run 12 years on noticing exactly this kind of thing, and the part of himself that had spent 2 years putting that part carefully away. I'll pay attention, he said. I always pay attention. He left. In the elevator going down, he stood with his hands in his pockets and let the pull of descent settle in his legs, and thought about nothing specific for exactly as long as the elevator ride lasted. Then the doors opened, and he walked through the lobby and out into the afternoon, where the city was doing what cities do in the middle of the afternoon in October, all exhaust and footsteps and the distant sound of a siren going somewhere urgent. He had 2 hours before school pickup. He used one of them to eat an actual meal, because Mason's comment about the cereal and coffee had lodged somewhere in him the way his son's comments tended to lodge. And then he drove to the school and sat in the pickup line with the radio off and thought about everything Serena Hawthorne had said and everything she hadn't said, and the way the investigation's logic pointed in a direction that no one had publicly named yet, and the way the injury pattern on Chloe's arm told a story that the official report was going to eventually catch up with, but hadn't yet. I thought about the fact that whoever had done this to an 8-year-old girl in a basement corridor had chosen to do it inside a building where Owen had worked for 2 years and 4 months, and where he knew every exit, every camera blind spot, every maintenance corridor and service entrance and pressure point. He thought about all of it. And then Mason came through the school doors in the familiar chaos of 3:15, backpack half-zipped, and one shoelace threatening to come undone, and spotted Gerald at the curb and changed direction toward him. And Owen watched his son walk across the schoolyard and felt the specific settled weight of the thing he'd decided 8 years ago and had kept deciding every morning since. Mason got in, dropped his backpack on the floor, looked at his father with the squinting appraisal of a kid who had learned, without being taught, to check whether his parent was okay before talking about his own day. You look weird, Mason said. I had a long night. Did something happen? Yeah. Mason waited. I'll tell you later, Owen said. Something to eat? There's a taco place on Clement. Gerald can probably make it to Clement. Gerald can definitely make it to Clement, Mason said, with the particular loyalty of a child defending a vehicle he had personally named. And Owen pulled out of the pickup line and into traffic, and the afternoon moved around them, ordinary and impermanent and his. But the part of his mind that had never really gone quiet, the part that had survived 12 years of training precisely because it refused to go quiet, was already sorting through everything it had noticed and everything it had filed away and everything that didn't add up. And it was doing this the way it always did, steadily, methodically, without alarm, the way water finds a crack and follows it, patient as gravity, certain of where it's going. He just hadn't decided yet what he was going to do about it. He decided 3 days later at 2:47 in the morning, standing in the east stairwell of Veyron Dynamics with a mop he wasn't using, watching a man in a maintenance uniform do something that no maintenance worker would ever do at 2:47 in the morning. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like crossing a line or reclaiming something or any of the other things that happened in the version of this story where the man in question was a different kind of person. It felt like noticing that water had found a crack, the way he'd known it would, and that ignoring it now would make him responsible for what came through. The man was on the sublevel corridor outside the building's secondary server room, and he was standing too still. That was the first thing, the stillness. Maintenance workers in active buildings, even at 3 in the morning, moved with a specific quality of purposeful distraction, the body language of someone who had a task and was executing it. This man was watching the corridor. He had a toolkit open at his feet, and his hands were near it, but not in it, and his eyes were on the camera at the corridor's far end with the specific attention of a person who was counting seconds. Owen had done enough surveillance to know what surveillance looked like from the other side of it. He didn't move. He stayed in the stairwell doorway where the angle of the door kept him in shadow, and he watched the man watch the camera, and he processed what he was looking at with the particular cold clarity that had once been the most reliable thing about him and that he had spent 2 years pretending he no longer had. The man reached into his jacket, not the toolkit, and removed a device approximately the size and shape of a thick phone that Owen recognized as a signal jammer. A specific model, the kind that disrupted short-range wireless communication rather than broad spectrum, surgical rather than obvious. The kind you bought through channels that didn't have a retail storefront. This was not a maintenance worker. Owen stepped back into the stairwell and let the door close silently and moved up one floor with the specific quiet of a man who had learned to move through spaces without announcing himself in environments where announcing yourself had consequences. He pulled out his phone and called Marco's security line. Marco picked up on the second ring, which meant he was either awake or had the instincts to answer before his brain had fully engaged, both of which Owen had come to rely on. "I need you to look at the sublevel camera feed outside server room B," Owen said. "Do not send anyone yet, just look." A pause. The sound of Marco moving, a chair, something clicking. "Which?" "Sublevel 2. The east corridor. Look at the man near the secondary access panel." Another pause, longer. Then, "That's a maintenance uniform." "Check the roster. Who's authorized in sublevel 2 tonight?" A longer pause. Owen waited in the stairwell while Marco pulled the authorization log and cross-referenced it against whatever he was seeing on camera, and the building breathed its nighttime breath around him, and somewhere below a man with a signal jammer was counting seconds next to a camera. "Nobody," Marco said, and his voice had changed. "Nobody's authorized in sublevel 2 after midnight tonight. The HVAC team finished at 11:30. How many exits from sublevel 2? 3. East stairwell where you are, west stairwell, and the service elevator. Lock the service elevator now, quietly. Don't trigger an alarm, then call me back." Owen was already moving back down the stairs as he said it, not running, moving with the controlled speed of someone who had made the calculation that speed and noise were not the same thing and had learned which one mattered when. He reached the sublevel door and paused with his hand on it and listened. Footsteps. Moving away from him. The man had finished whatever he was doing at the camera and was heading toward the west corridor. Owen eased the door open and followed. What he was doing was not, technically, his job. He had thought about this in the 3 days since the hospital visit, in the specific way he thought about things that he hadn't decided yet. Not front of mind, not obsessive, just present in the background like a radio in another room, audible whenever the other noise stopped. He had thought about Serena saying, "I'll pay attention. I always pay attention." He had thought about the injury pattern on Chloe's arm. He had thought about the logic of whoever had planned the first attempt being the kind of person who made contingency plans, and about how the investigation was 3 days old now and moving at the speed of official investigations, which was to say slowly, and about how the gap between official speed and operational speed was where things tended to go wrong. He had thought about all of it and arrived, not at a decision exactly, but at a readiness, which was how it had always worked. You didn't decide in advance, you got ready, and then when the moment arrived, you were already there. The man rounded the west corridor toward the sublevel records archive. Owen followed him at a distance that kept him invisible and gave him enough time to stop if the man stopped, and he tracked the movement and the purpose of it and the destination and began to understand what he was looking at. The records archive held physical backups of Veyron's patent documentation, the old filing system that hadn't been fully digitized, the original paperwork for the technology portfolios that the digital records referenced but didn't fully contain. It was the kind of room that mattered enormously if you were making a legal case for or against ownership of intellectual property. It was also the kind of room that would be extremely useful to access if you were, for instance, attempting to establish a competing claim to a patent that was currently being contested in a corporate dispute. Owen stopped at the corner of the corridor and watched the man pause outside the archive room door and do something to the keypad with the device from his jacket. Not the jammer, a different device, smaller, pressed against the side of the panel, and the lock released with a sound that was much quieter than a legitimate entry. His phone buzzed. Marco. Elevator locked. What do you need? Owen typed back one-handed. West Corridor Sublevel Records Archive. He's going in now. I need you to have 2 people at the west stairwell exit and 2 at the east. No contact until I tell you. If he makes the stairwell before you hear from me, detain him. A pause. Then, Owen. You're the night janitor. Yes, Owen typed. Put your people at the exits. He put the phone in his pocket. He thought about Mason. He did this not sentimentally but practically, the way he always had. Mason was the variable that changed the calculation. Mason was the reason the calculation existed at all. And the calculation right now said that a man was entering a room that he had no business being in a building that was still an active crime scene from 3 nights ago, and that whatever he found or didn't find in that room in the next several minutes was going to affect an investigation that was currently the only thing standing between Chloe Hawthorne and whoever had sent the first team. The calculation resolved. He moved. The archive room door was still drifting closed when Owen reached it and put his hand against it and pushed through. The room was dark except for the beam of a small flashlight, and in the flashlight beam the man in the maintenance uniform was moving along a row of filing cabinets with practiced efficiency, pulling folders and photographing them with a device that he held close to the pages. He didn't hear Owen until Owen was already across the room. The man turned and started to reach inside his jacket with his free hand, and Owen moved his arm before the reach completed, which was not something he had planned or considered. It was the kind of response that lived below the level of thought, in the part of the nervous system that had been trained to execute before the thinking brain caught up. He had the man's arm controlled and the device knocked from his other hand in approximately 2 seconds, and in the next 2 seconds, he had the man's back against the filing cabinet with his arm in a position that made moving it inadvisable. "Don't," Owen said. The man was breathing hard. I was younger than Owen had expected, late 20s maybe, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had been trained to reveal nothing. He said nothing. "The device you used on the keypad is still in your jacket," Owen said. "Don't reach for it." The man's eyes moved, assessing, calculating exits, calculating angles, calculating whether the man holding him was someone who could be handled if the moment presented itself. "I did 7 years of this for the Navy," Owen said quietly. "I know what you're calculating. Save yourself the injury." The man went still. Marco's security team reached the room 4 minutes later, which Owen tracked with the patience of a man who had once held positions for considerably longer than 4 minutes. When they came through the door, 2 guards and Marco himself, they found Owen standing in the center of the room with the intruder sitting against the wall and the photographed documents arranged on the table beside them, and every device the man had been carrying lined up in order on the floor. Marco looked at Owen. He looked at the lineup on the floor. He looked back at Owen. "Building services," Marco said. "Night shift," Owen said. The police took 4 hours to process the scene, which meant Owen's shift ended and he stayed anyway, which meant he missed the morning routine for the first time in 11 days and had to call Mrs. Delgado at 5:30 and ask her to get Mason to school. She said, of course, without asking for an explanation, which was exactly why he had continued to bring tamales on Sundays without fail. He gave his statement to a detective named Ferris, who was thorough and unhurried and who wrote in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil and occasionally looked at Owen over the notebook with the expression of a person who was storing additional questions for later. Owen answered what was asked and did not add things that weren't asked, which was a habit so ingrained he no longer noticed it. "You were following this individual through the sublevel," Ferris said. Not a question. A recitation of facts being confirmed. "I observed someone behaving inconsistently with their uniform in the hour," Owen said. "I followed until I could determine whether I was seeing something that warranted action." "And you determined it did?" "Yes." and your background that qualified you to make that determination. I'm the night maintenance worker, Owen said. My background is 12 years of military service. I'm not here in a professional capacity. I'm here because I work in this building and I saw something. Ferris looked at him over the notebook. You also intervened 3 nights ago in the incident involving Ms. Hawthorne's daughter. I provided first aid. You organized the emergency response. I suggested some things. Ferris wrote something. Mr. Strickland, I'm not criticizing you. I'm trying to understand the shape of what happened so I can do my job correctly. Owen looked at him. The man in that room was photographing original patent documentation from the archive. The devices he carried suggest professional training and resources beyond a standard break-in. The signal jammer was aimed at suppressing the wireless backup on the archive room camera, not the camera itself, which means he knew there was a wireless backup system, which is not public knowledge. That's your shape. Ferris looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something considerably longer than what he'd been writing before. The man in custody refused to say anything useful until his lawyer arrived, which happened at 8 in the morning, at which point the conversation between the lawyer and Detective Ferris lasted 40 minutes and produced, ultimately, a name. Owen wasn't in the room when the name was produced. He was in the building's first-floor break room with a cup of coffee that he was drinking because it was there and he needed something to do with his hands, and the name reached him via Marco, who came through the break room door with the expression of a man who had processed something large and was still working out how to say it. Preston Vale, Marco said. Owen looked at him. Veyron's chief strategy officer, Marco said. The devices the guy was carrying. The forensics team tracked the purchase through a shell company that routes back to a holding structure Vale controls. The police are saying it's preliminary, but preliminary is enough to make a call, Owen said. They're calling Ms. Hawthorne now. Owen put his coffee cup down on the table. He thought about the hospital room and the monitoring equipment and Serena's face when she said whoever set this up had access to your personal schedule. I thought about the kind of access a chief strategy officer had to a CEO's private calendar. He thought about the specific ugliness of someone spending months in a trusted position, building the information they needed to do what had been done to an 8-year-old girl in a basement corridor. He didn't say any of this to Marco because Marco was processing it himself and didn't need Owen's version. Go do what you need to do, Owen said. I'll finish the shift. Marco looked at him. Your shift ended an hour ago, so I'm working overtime. Owen, the East Corridor didn't get finished last night, Owen said. Go. Marco went. Owen sat in the break room for another few minutes and then got up and found his mop and went to the East Corridor. What? Serena arrived at the building at 10:15, which was faster than Owen had expected given that she was coming from the hospital where Chloe was still recovering, but then he was learning that Serena Hawthorne moved faster than he expected most of the time. She came through the lobby with Diana Chu. 2 steps behind her, and her expression was the controlled fury of a woman who had been given information that confirmed what she had feared and was now in the process of deciding what to do about it. She found Owen in the East Corridor. She stopped when she saw him. He had his back to her and heard her stop and turned around. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the mop. She looked back at him. You found him, she said. I noticed him, Owen said. Marco's team found him. Owen. She said his name with the kind of weight that meant she was about to disagree with the distinction he'd made. You followed him through a sub-level corridor at 3 in the morning and physically detained him. I prevented him from leaving until security arrived. That is... She stopped. She pressed one hand briefly to her mouth and then lowered it. That is not what I would call a minor thing. He had information on him that your investigators needed before it disappeared, Owen said. The timing mattered. I know the timing mattered. Her voice was not angry. It was something more complicated than angry. The specific register of a person who is grappling with gratitude. They don't know how to properly express, and frustration that exists alongside it, because being in a position to need that gratitude is itself uncomfortable. Vale, she said. Yes. 12 years. He's been with the company for 12 years. She said it like she was trying to understand the arithmetic of it, how 12 years of working proximity led to what had happened in the corridor 3 nights ago. He was in the room when the patent dispute started. He knew the timeline. He knew the filing strategy. He knew... She stopped. He knew my schedule because he helped me build my schedule. He had my daughter's school pickup time in a shared calendar because I trusted him to coordinate logistics. Owen didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would make that sentence smaller. They arrested him this morning, she said, at his office. I watched it on the security feed. She paused. I don't know how I feel about that. You don't have to know yet. She looked at him. Is that what you do? When something happens that you haven't processed? Sometimes. What's the other option? Process it wrong and have to redo it later, he said. That takes longer. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of the shape that a smile would take if the circumstances were different. It was the first time he'd seen that happen on her face, and it was, he noticed, distinct. The man you detained, she said. He hasn't said anything yet. He won't, Owen said. Not until his lawyer has had time to assess what the evidence actually shows. Then he'll make a calculation about what's in his best interest to say versus withhold. That's probably 12 to 24 hours from now. You sound very certain about that. I've been on the other side of those conversations, Owen said. The calculation is fairly standard. Serena studied him. She did this openly, the way she probably studied balance sheets and acquisition proposals, with the focused attention of someone trying to understand something she needed to understand correctly. It was not entirely comfortable to be looked at that way, and Owen held it with the stillness that came from years of being in positions where stillness was the correct response. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to tell me if it's out of line. Ask. Last night, when you saw him in the corridor, you made the call to follow him and then to act. She paused. Were you scared? Owen considered the question with the seriousness it was asked with. In the moment, no. That comes after. It came after? In the break room, he said. Around 7:15, drank bad coffee and waited for it to pass. She was quiet. Fear's not the problem, he said. Fear's just information. It tells you what you're protecting. The problem is when you let the information run the decision. Serena looked at him for a long moment. Is that something they taught you, or something you figured out? Bit of both, he said. Neither one was comfortable. Diana Chu appeared at the corridor entrance and said, Ms. Hawthorne, the legal team is ready. And Serena straightened slightly, the micro-adjustment of a person returning from one mode of being to another. I have to go do what I do, she said. I know. She took 2 steps and stopped, turned back. Owen, thank you. And I know you're going to tell me you were just doing your job, so let me say it before you do. You were doing considerably more than your job, and I am aware of that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, even if you would prefer that I did. He let that sit for a moment. Tell Chloe I hope the arm heals fast, he said. Something genuine and not entirely controlled moved across Serena's face, and then she nodded once and followed Diana Chu toward the elevators. Owen turned back to his mop. The east corridor was 40 feet long, and he'd done half of it. He finished the other half with the same methodical attention he gave everything, starting from the far end and working back toward the stairwell. And when it was done properly, and he stowed the mop and the bucket in the maintenance closet and signed out of his shift at 11:02. He sat in Gerald in the parking structure for a while. The thing about 12 years of a particular life was that it left deposits. Not just training, not just the physical knowledge in your hands and your legs and your nervous system, but a way of reading the world, a persistent alertness that didn't fully shut off when you wanted it to, that sat underneath the ordinary surface of ordinary days and noticed things, and filed them, and made connections that you hadn't asked it to make. He had thought, for 2 years and 4 months, that he had buried it deeply enough. He had built a life on the assumption that it was buried. The mop, the corridors, Gerald with his cracked windshield, Mason's cereal in the cabinet, Mrs. Delgado's tamale sundaes, all of it had been constructed on the assumption that the part of him that had operated in sublevels and corridors and darkness was the past, and the part of him that drove his son to school and fixed broken cartwheel brackets was the present, and the two did not need to be in conversation. The last 4 days had made that assumption difficult to sustain. He wasn't sure what to do with that. I wasn't sure whether there was anything to do with it or whether it was simply information, the way fear was information, something to acknowledge and not allow to run the decision. His phone buzzed. Mason, can we do tacos again tonight? Owen looked at the message. He thought about the archive room and the devices lined up on the floor, and Detective Ferris's mechanical pencil, and Preston Vale's name arriving in the break room like something that had been building for months and finally come to its destination. He typed back, "Sure. Gerald's buying." Mason, "Gerald doesn't have money. He's a truck." Owen, "Then I'm buying. Same thing." A pause. Then Mason sent back a taco emoji, which Owen had not known existed until Mason had entered his life with the full vocabulary of 10-year-old digital communication, and which he now considered a reasonable form of affirmative response. He started Gerald and pulled out of the parking structure and into the October afternoon and drove toward the school, and in the background of everything, the traffic and the radio he kept off, and the crack in the windshield that he still hadn't fixed, the part of his mind that refused to go quiet was still working, still sorting, still following the water along the crack to wherever it was going. Preston Vale had been arrested. His hired man was in custody. The evidence was accumulating in the hands of people whose job it was to do something with it. It should have felt finished. It didn't feel finished. And Owen had learned, in 12 years of operating in places where getting that feeling wrong had consequences, to trust the feeling. He didn't know yet what wasn't finished. He filed the question where he filed everything else that didn't have an answer yet, and drove toward his son and the tacos in the evening ahead, and the building disappeared in the rearview mirror behind him, and the day closed around the ordinary fact of a father picking up his kid, which was both exactly what it appeared to be and something he refused to take for granted, because he had learned that too, in the years before the mop and the corridors, and Gerald learned it the way you learn the things that cost the most, slowly and out of order, and too late in some cases and just barely in time in others. He had been just barely in time for the right things. He intended to keep being that. The arrest of Preston Vale moved through the upper floors of Veyron Dynamics, the way a stone moves through still water. The initial impact visible only to those standing close, and then the ripples traveling outward in every direction until they reached the edges of things, and there was nowhere left for them to go. The board convened an emergency session the morning after the arrest. Legal filed 3 separate motions by noon. Corporate Communications drafted a containment statement that Serena reviewed for 11 minutes, and then rewrote almost entirely in language that was direct enough to mean something, and careful enough not to detonate anything prematurely. She did all of this from Chloe's hospital room, with her laptop on the rolling tray table and her phone pressed to her ear at intervals, and Chloe asleep or watching television in the bed beside her. And whenever Chloe was watching television, Serena put the phone down and watched it with her, because she had made a decision in the hours after the corridor that she had not yet articulated to anyone, but was operating on with a consistency that surprised even herself. The decision was simple and had no name. It was just, be here. Not managing the being here from a slight remove, not being physically present while mentally constructing the next 12 items on the executive agenda. Here. The way Chloe was here, unself-consciously, with her full attention on whatever was in front of her, unashamed of needing what she needed. It was, Serena was discovering, considerably more difficult than running a company. Chloe was discharged on the 4th day, which was also the day Preston Vale's lawyer made the first formal statement to prosecutors. A statement that, according to Detective Ferris, contained enough specific information about the network of shell corporations and hired operatives that the case was now considerably larger than one chief strategy officer's theft ambitions. Vale had apparently decided that the calculation favored cooperation over silence, which was exactly the timeline Owen had predicted in the East Corridor, and which Serena thought about for a while before deciding she was not going to let herself be surprised by the fact that Owen Strickland had predicted it correctly. She was learning to adjust her expectations on that front. Chloe came home to the apartment, not the main Hawthorne residence, which was currently being swept by security consultants as a precaution, but the smaller place Serena kept for the weeks when she worked late enough that commuting to the main house made no sense. It had 3 bedrooms and a kitchen that Serena almost never used, and a view of the bay that Chloe immediately claimed as hers by pressing her face against the living room window and saying, "I can see a boat." "There are many boats," Serena said, setting down Chloe's hospital bag. "I can see a specific boat," Chloe said. "The blue one. I'm naming it." "You can't name someone else's boat." "I'm naming it in my head." "That's allowed." Serena looked at her daughter, the cast on her arm, the fading bruise along her cheekbone that was moving from purple into the yellowish stages of healing, the complete and total 8-year-old certainty that the boat question was settled, and felt something move through her that she didn't try to name because it was too large and had too many parts. "What are you naming it?" she said. Chloe thought for a moment. "Gerald?" Serena blinked. "What?" "I heard the janitor's truck has a name. I like the name. The boat is Gerald now." "How do you know about the janitor's truck?" "He told me," Chloe said, still looking at the boat. "When I woke up, in the room. He was there for a little while, and I asked him questions." Serena set down what she was holding very carefully. "He was in your hospital room?" "Just for a little while. I think he came to check." Chloe turned from the window. "He's nice. He doesn't talk a lot, but when he talks, it's actually about things. Not the fake stuff." "What's the fake stuff?" "When people ask how you're feeling and they don't actually want to know." Chloe delivered this with the precision of a child who had spent considerable time in the company of adults who operated this way. "He asked how my arm was, and then he waited for the whole answer. Most people say, 'How are you?' and they're already looking at something else." Serena sat down on the couch. She thought about Owen in a hospital room she hadn't known he'd visited, asking a question and waiting for the whole answer. She thought about the fact that he had not mentioned this in the East Corridor, or in any of the other brief and functional conversations they'd had since the night in the underground. She thought about a man who did things without requiring acknowledgement of them, who fixed cartwheel brackets and reorganized emergency equipment, and stopped intruders in sublevels, and apparently visited 8-year-old girls in hospitals, all with the same particular quality of attention, and then went back to his mop and his truck and his 10-year-old son as if none of it required comment. She thought about how long she had walked past him. 2 years and 4 months, Owen had said. 2 years and 4 months in the same building, and she had known his name from a memo about a cartwheel. She found him 11 days after the arrest, on a Thursday afternoon, outside Mason's school. She had not planned to go to the school. She had planned, Diana Chu had planned on her behalf, a meeting at the legal offices across town that had then been pushed by 2 hours, which left a gap in the afternoon that Serena usually filled by moving a different meeting into it, but that she filled today, without fully deciding to, by driving to the address she had found in the building's personnel records. She sat in the car across the street and felt, for approximately 3 minutes, that she was doing something intrusive and possibly strange. Then she felt that she had made worse decisions under less justification and got out of the car. Owen was sitting on the low wall outside the school's main entrance with a paper coffee cup that was probably from the cart on the corner, because the cart on the corner was the only coffee option within reasonable walking distance of the school's pickup zone, and Owen Strickland struck her as a person who took the reasonable option when the reasonable option was sufficient. He was in street clothes, dark jacket, jeans, work boots that had seen considerable use, and he was looking at his phone with the unfocused attention of a person who wasn't really looking at their phone so much as resting their eyes on something while they thought about something else. He looked up when she approached. If he was surprised, it was a brief surprise, the kind that crossed a person's face and was processed and set aside in under a second. He looked at her and then looked back at the school entrance and said, "You could have called." "I could have," she agreed. She looked at the wall. He shifted slightly and she sat down beside him, which put them both facing the school at roughly the same angle, which was either very natural or slightly absurd, and she couldn't decide which. "How's Chloe?" he said. "She named a boat Gerald." A pause. "That's my truck's name." "I know. She told me." Serena looked at him. "You visited her." "Once." He said it without apology, but also without the deflective quality he sometimes used when he didn't want a thing examined. "She was awake, and I was in the building. She seemed like the kind of kid who doesn't like lying in a room with nothing happening." "It's not," Serena said. "She asked questions at a rate that genuinely exhausts professional adults. She asked me if the Navy was like the movies." "What did you tell her?" "Louder and less convenient," Owen said. "And the food is significantly worse." Serena heard herself make a sound that was almost a laugh, which surprised her because she hadn't laughed at anything in 11 days and had stopped noticing its absence. They were quiet for a moment. Down the block, a delivery truck was attempting to navigate a turning radius it didn't have, and a crossing guard was watching with the philosophical patience of someone who had seen this exact situation many times and knew how it ended. "I'm not here to offer you money," Serena said. "I know." "How do you know?" Because you drove here yourself, he said. You don't drive yourself to things that are transactional. Diana Chu drives you to those. He glanced at her. Also, you looked at the wall before you sat down. People who are here to make an offer don't look at the wall. They stay standing. Serena looked at him. You notice things like that. I notice most things, he said. It's a liability sometimes. I imagine it is. The school doors opened at the far end of the entrance area, and the first wave of children began coming through. The organized chaos of 315, all backpacks and competing conversations, and the specific energy of people who have been required to be still for several hours and are done with that requirement. Owen straightened slightly, which was the adjustment of a person scanning for a specific face in a crowd. Serena watched him watch the doors. She thought about what Chloe had said. He asks about things and waits for the whole answer. She thought about Owen in the break room at 7:15 letting fear pass through him like weather. She thought about a man who had turned down numbers that would have changed his material life because the numbers came with conditions that conflicted with the one job he'd decided was the job. I've been thinking, she said, about what you told me in the hospital, about why you took the position at Veyron. Okay, he said, still watching the doors. You said the pay was enough, that you were okay. We are. I know. She paused. I'm not disputing that. She stopped, recalibrated, tried again. I've spent 8 years building something. Veyron is worth more than I sometimes know what to do with, and I built it partly because I believed that financial security was the most substantive thing I could give Chloe. That if the number was large enough, everything else would be manageable. She looked at her hands. And then she nearly died in my building, and the person who arranged it had 12 years of my trust and unlimited access to everything I'd built, and the person who kept her alive was someone I'd been walking past for 2 years without really seeing. Owen was quiet. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with, she said. No, he agreed. I imagine it isn't. I'm not telling you this because I want something from you, she said. I'm telling you because you were honest with me in the hospital, and it seems like the right direction to go in. He turned and looked at her then. Really looked. The way he had in the corridor when she'd grabbed his uniform. That particular quality of attention that didn't perform anything, that just took in what was there without adding to it. What do you want? He said. Not unkindly. The question of a person who preferred directness to circling. I want to offer you a position, Serena said. Not because I owe you, and not because it's transactional. Because Veyron needs something it doesn't currently have, and you are, demonstrably at this point, the person who should build it. She paused. We don't have a real emergency preparedness framework. We have compliance documents and a security team that's good at its specific job and completely unequipped for the things that don't fit that job's description. What happened in the corridor, what happened with Vale's man in the archive room, neither of those should have reached the point they reached before someone with the right eyes noticed. Owen looked back at the school doors. That's a real problem. I know it's a real problem. I've been running a company for 8 years and didn't have a solution to it until 11 days ago. The solution was the guy with the mop, he said. The solution is someone who pays attention the way you pay attention, she said. And who can teach other people to pay attention similarly, and who can build systems that make attention less dependent on one specific person being in the right corridor at the right time. She paused. I don't want you because you're a former SEAL. I want you because you fixed the cartwheel bracket and reorganized the equipment storage and noticed the maintenance worker who wasn't a maintenance worker, and none of those things required combat training. They required someone who actually cares whether things work. Owen was quiet for a moment. Down the entrance walkway, children were still flowing out through the doors, and the crossing guard had successfully guided the delivery truck through its impossible turn and was returning to her post with the satisfaction of someone who had resolved exactly what she expected to resolve. Terms, Owen said. You set them. He glanced at her. That's not how negotiations work. I'm not negotiating, she said. I'm offering. Tell me what you need the position to be and I'll tell you whether that's workable. I expect it will be. He looked at the school doors again. Mason's school pickup is 3:15, non-negotiable. Understood. Understood. Morning drop-off is 7:45, also non-negotiable. Also understood. If he's sick, I'm home. If there's a school event, concerts, parent meetings, anything, I'm there. Owen, I'm not negotiating those things down, he said. Those aren't leverage points. They're the shape of the job. I'm not asking you to negotiate them down, Serena said. I'm agreeing to them, all of them. She looked at him steadily. I'm also... She stopped. I'm changing my own schedule, starting now. Evenings are Chloe's. Weekends are Chloe's. I've been doing the math on what I thought I was building, and the math turns out to be wrong in a fairly significant way, so I'm revising the calculation. Owen looked at her. She's going to notice. I know. Kids notice when a parent actually shows up. It takes them a while to trust it, but they notice immediately. I know that too, Serena said. I'm counting on it. Something shifted in the set of his shoulders. Not much. The kind of shift that was only visible because she'd spent 11 days learning to read the specific vocabulary of his stillness. The compensation, he started. Fair market for the role plus 20%, she said. Because I should have been paying attention 2 years ago, and I wasn't. That's not how market rates work. I own the company, she said. I determine the market. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been presented with a logic he couldn't immediately counter and wasn't sure he wanted to. I'd need to think about it. Of course. And talk to Mason. She blinked. You consult your 10-year-old on employment decisions? He lives in the decision, Owen said simply. He should have a voice in it. Serena sat with that for a moment. She thought about the quarterly board meetings where she announced strategic pivots that affected hundreds of employees' daily lives, and the fact that the announcement was the consultation, and the fact that she had never once framed it differently because it had never occurred to her to frame it differently. She thought about a 10-year-old boy who had lost his mother at 2 and whose father had rebuilt his entire professional life around the shape of being present for him, who sat in a truck called Gerald and ate cereal that belonged to his son and drove a route past the school every afternoon at 3:15 as reliably as anything in the universe. That's, she started, stopped. That's a good practice, she said. The school doors opened wider as the main surge of 3:15 arrived, and Owen stood from the wall and she stood beside him, and then she saw him see Mason, the micro-relaxation in his posture that happened when his eyes found his son, the thing that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one and more genuine than most smiles she'd seen from him. Mason came through the outer gate with his backpack compromised in the usual ways and his shoelace in its usual state of negotiation with the boot. And he saw Owen, and then saw Owen was not alone, and slowed slightly. He approached with the careful peripheral attention of a kid assessing a situation. Hey, he said to Owen. Hey, Owen said. Good day? Eraser Kid gave it back, Mason said. Progress. Eventually, Mason looked at Serena with the direct, non-hostile appraisal of a child who had been raised to look at things rather than pass them. Hi. Hi, Serena said. I'm Serena. I know, Mason said. You're the boss where my dad works. He appeared to consider additional information. He talks about you. Owen said, Mason. What? You do. In what capacity? Owen said, which was clearly parental code for please elaborate so I can assess the damage. Just like that she's... Mason appeared to select from available descriptions, that she's figuring some things out. He said this with the serene unself-consciousness of a 10-year-old who has no idea he's described something the adult would find precise enough to be uncomfortable. Serena looked at Owen. Owen was looking at Gerald, parked at the curb. That's fair, Serena said. Mason seemed satisfied with this. He looked between the two of them with the lateral alertness of a child triangulating adult dynamics, and then made the pragmatic decision to start walking toward the truck. Is she coming for tacos? He said over his shoulder. She wasn't invited for tacos, Owen said. You can come for tacos, Mason said to Serena, as if his father's statement had been definitionally incorrect rather than socially complex. Mason, it's rude not to offer, Mason said, with the absolute certainty of a person quoting a rule at someone who had taught him that rule. Owen looked at Serena with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one he wore when something had happened that he hadn't planned for and was deciding in real time whether to manage it or let it be. You don't have to, he said. I have nowhere to be until 6, she said. And then, before she could think about whether this was sensible or professional or any of the other things she usually thought about before making decisions. I like tacos. Owen looked at her for a moment. Gerald's a tight fit with 3. I have a car. You'd follow us? Yes. He considered this. It was, she was learning, a genuine consideration. He was not performing deliberation, he was doing it. He said something with this quality of deliberation that she had started to watch for because it was so completely different from the way most people in her life decided things, which was to reach for the answer that looked best and then build the reasoning afterward. Clement Street, he said, the one with the green sign. Don't park in the loading zone, they actually enforce it. The taco place had 6 tables and a counter where you ordered, and a television in the corner showing a soccer game with the sound turned down, and it smelled the way places smell. When the same things have been cooked in the same kitchen for a long time, and the walls have absorbed it. Owen and Mason clearly had a usual order, because the woman at the counter greeted Mason by name and began assembling something without being told. Serena ordered the thing Owen suggested when she asked what was good, which was the fish tacos, and they found a table near the window that fit 3 chairs if one of them was slightly sideways, which was Mason's chair because he volunteered for it with the adaptability of a kid used to fitting into whatever configuration presented itself. The conversation was not what she had expected, which was a theme where Owen was concerned. She wasn't certain what she'd expected. Something effortful. The specific quality of 2 adults trying to include a child while managing a conversation the child wasn't quite part of. What happened instead was that Mason talked about the eraser situation with an analysis that was more sophisticated than his 10 years would suggest, and Owen listened and asked 2 or 3 questions that were actually useful rather than parental filler, and Serena found herself contributing a perspective from her own experience at that age, involving a shared calculator and a classmate who was also selective about returning it. And Mason looked at her with the focused interest of a person who has just discovered that an adult might have relevant information on a topic he cares about. "What did you do?" he said. "I bought 2 calculators," she said. Mason stared at her. "That's what my dad said." Your dad was right. It's not about the calculator," Mason said. "I know," she said, "but sometimes solving the practical problem is faster than solving the other problem. And once you've solved the practical problem, you have more patience for the other one." Mason ate a taco and appeared to process this. "Did it work? With your calculator thing?" "Eventually," she said. "The kid and I actually ended up on the same team project the following year and worked fine together. But I had to stop being annoyed about the calculator first." Mason looked at his father. "That's different from what you said." "I said get 2 erasers," Owen said. She said, "Why to get 2 erasers?" "Those are compatible." "Huh," Mason said, in the tone of a person revising a position without fully announcing the revision. They ate. Outside, the afternoon did what it did in October, the light going amber earlier than it should, the street traffic settling into the specific rhythm of the between hours when the day people were home and the evening people hadn't yet arrived. Serena ate her fish tacos and listened to Mason describe a science project involving condensation with a level of enthusiasm that exceeded what she might have predicted for condensation, and she watched Owen track his son's face the way people track things they're responsible for and grateful for in the same gesture, and she thought about Chloe at the apartment window naming a boat after a truck. She thought about what it had cost Owen to build what he'd built. Not financially, that math was obvious. The other cost, the one that didn't have a number, the contracting offers he'd turned down, the years of floors and corridors, the deliberate smallness of a life that had been constructed specifically to be present for one person, and the way that deliberate smallness had required, every single day, the decision not to be what he had been. She thought about the 12 years before that life, the things he had done in those 12 years that she would never fully know, and that he clearly had no interest in performing for anyone, the skills that lived in his hands and his nervous system, and that had appeared on a Tuesday night in an underground corridor when an 8-year-old girl needed them. "Mason," she said, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from the condensation explanation. "Sure." "Does your dad tell you much about his time in the Navy?" Mason thought about this seriously. "Some things. Not everything. He says some things are his to keep. Do you mind that?" "Sometimes," Mason said with the honesty that was clearly a direct inheritance. "But he says the important stuff, like why he left and why we live the way we do." He glanced at Owen, who was looking at the table. "He says the most important thing he did was come home." The table was quiet for a moment. Owen picked up his coffee cup and put it down without drinking from it. "He's right," Serena said. "I know," Mason said simply. Then, with the subject-changing instinct of a kid who has sensed adult emotion moving through the room like weather and decided to redirect, "Do you know how to tell when condensation is going to form? There's a formula." "Tell me," Serena said. He told her. It took 6 minutes and involved a paper napkin diagram and 2 corrections of the diagram and one moment where Mason caught his own error before she could and said, "Wait, no," and started over, which was the moment she noticed Owen looking at his son with the quiet and total attention of a person watching something he built, and which was also, she thought, the most human she had seen him look. She stayed until the place started filling with the early dinner crowd, and Mason announced he had homework involving fractions, which he described as specifically designed to ruin evenings, but which he clearly intended to do regardless of his position on its design. They walked out together into the amber afternoon, and at the point where Serena's car was in one direction and Gerald was in another, they stopped. "Thank you," she said, to both of them, which felt right. Mason said, "You're welcome," with the automatic good manners that apparently only appeared in full outside of Owen's immediate supervision, and then told his father he was going to wait at the truck and walked off. Owen watched him go, then looked at Serena. "The position," he said. "You don't have to decide today." "I know." He paused. "Mason said he didn't mind. I asked him last week. I told him I might be considering something different and that it would change the schedule some." "You asked him last week," she said, "before I came to the school." "I knew you were coming." She looked at him. "How?" "Because the investigation pointed somewhere and you needed to understand where, and the corridor conversation wasn't finished." He said it without self-satisfaction. "You were going to come." "And the position offer?" "Educated inference," he said. "You'd already reorganized the security structure twice in 11 days. You were missing something and you knew what it was." Serena looked at him for a moment. "You're going to be very difficult to manage." "I'm not planning to be managed," he said. "I'm planning to do the job." "That's going to require some adjustment on my end." "Probably," he said. "You adjust fast. That's been clear." She wasn't sure whether that was a compliment. She suspected it was something more precise than a compliment. An observation delivered straight, without the social padding that made observations easier to receive and less accurate. "Tell Diana your terms," she said. "All of them. She'll confirm what's workable, but I already told you it will be." He nodded once. "Owen." She said it the way she'd said it in the hospital room when she'd been about to say something real. "What happened with Chloe? And then with Vale's man in the archive? You didn't have to do either of those things the way you did them." "I know. Most people wouldn't have." "I'm aware." "I'm not saying it to flatter you," she said. "I'm saying it because I think you've spent a long time making yourself invisible, and I don't think it actually worked. I think people like you don't actually go invisible. They just stop being seen by people who aren't looking." Owen was quiet. "I was looking the wrong direction," she said. "I'm correcting that." He held her gaze for a moment. "Don't make me a project," he said. Not harshly. The warning of a person who knew what that felt like. "I'm not," she said. "I'm telling you that I see you. That's different." The amber light came at a lower angle now, and the street around them was doing its October early evening thing, and somewhere down the block Gerald was waiting with his cracked windshield and Mason's name and the homework that was specifically designed to ruin evenings. Owen looked at her the same way he'd looked at her in the hospital room and the corridor, and every other moment when she'd said something real and he'd received it without performing a response, just took it in, processed it, and responded with what was actually true rather than what was convenient. "See you Monday," he said. She nodded. He walked toward the truck. She stood on the sidewalk and watched him go and thought about the way he walked. Not the tactical economy she'd noticed in the corridor when everything was urgent, but the ordinary walk of a man with somewhere to be that mattered to him, unhurried and specific, the walk of someone who knew where home was. She thought about Chloe's boat named Gerald. She thought about a 10-year-old who said the most important thing he did was come home. She got in her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine and thought that she had spent 8 years building a company partly to give Chloe the most protected life she could construct, and that what she had nearly given her instead was a mother who was always somewhere else, and that the man she'd been walking past for 2 years and 4 months had understood the arithmetic of that better than she had, and had made his choice accordingly, and that she was, with some significant effort and discomfort, in the process of making hers. She started the engine and drove toward her daughter and the boat named Gerald. And the evening that was, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, hers to actually spend. The first Monday was harder than Owen had expected, which was itself something he hadn't expected. He was not generally a person who misjudged difficulty. He had spent 12 years in environments where misjudging difficulty had consequences that went beyond professional embarrassment, and he had developed, through that experience, a reasonably accurate internal calibration for how hard things were going to be before they were. The problem with the first Monday was that the difficulty wasn't the job itself. The job was clear. Serena had given him 3 floors of offices, a mandate that was deliberately broad. Build the thing we don't have, define it as you go, and a budget that he'd looked at for a long time before concluding that it was real and not a negotiating starting position. He had a small team of 2 people who'd been reassigned from corporate security, a former EMT named Bridget, who was competent and direct and asked questions without being defensive about not knowing things, and a retired firefighter named Carlos, who had the particular quality of stillness that Owen recognized from people who had spent time in situations where panic was the enemy. They were not a large team. They were, he thought, the right team. The difficulty was the building itself. He knew this building the way you know a place you've moved through in the dark, by feel, by the specific sound each floor made under different conditions, by the location of every anomaly and every inefficiency and every gap between what the building was supposed to do and what it actually did at 2 in the morning when nobody was paying attention. He knew it as the night janitor. He knew which emergency lights had been on the replacement list for 3 months, and which stairwell door caught in humid weather, and which section of the sublevel corridor had a drain that backed up under heavy rain and created a slip hazard that had never been formally documented. He knew all of it. And now he was walking through it in different clothes, with different authority, and the building was the same building, and the people in it were the same people, and they looked at him with the specific expression of people who are trying to reconcile 2 incompatible pieces of information and haven't managed it yet. He passed the security desk on the ground floor where a guard named Terry had given him a friendly nod every night for 2 years and 4 months. Terry looked at him on Monday morning with the nod frozen somewhere between the automatic version and a different version that hadn't yet assembled itself. "Mr. Strickland," Terry said. "Terry," Owen said, "the camera on the northeast corner of the lobby has been angled 2 degrees off its optimal position since February. When you get a moment, can you put in a maintenance request? The coverage gap it creates isn't large, but it exists." Terry looked at him, looked at the camera, looked back. Yes, sir." Owen went to the elevator. He was not, he told himself, going to enjoy being called sir. It was not a thing he intended to get comfortable with. He punched the button for the 7th floor and stood in the elevator with his hands in his pockets and told himself that the job was the job, and the title was just a description of the job, and neither of them changed what he was, which was a person who paid attention and fixed things and came home at 3:15. He was partially right and partially wrong about this, which was also something he hadn't fully predicted. The first month was the establishing of systems. Owen moved through the building with Bridget and Carlos and documented everything he'd been silently cataloging for 2 years. Every gap, every vulnerability, every place where the gap between protocol and practice had grown wide enough to drive a truck through. He produced reports that were dense and specific and largely without the kind of institutional throat-clearing that reports usually contained, and he presented them to Serena in meetings that lasted precisely as long as they needed to and not longer. Serena read everything. This surprised him, initially. He had expected the executive version of reading, which was the summary and the key points, and maybe the first paragraph of each section. Instead, she read the full documents and came to the meetings with questions that were occasionally uncomfortable because they were the right questions, the ones that required him to account for something he'd glossed over or assumed rather than verified. "The sublevel access protocol," she said in the 3rd week. "You flagged the camera blind spots, but you haven't recommended a specific remedy. Because the specific remedy depends on a budget decision I don't have authority to make," he said. "You have the authority. I gave it to you." The memo said I had authority up to a threshold. The camera system replacement is above the threshold. She looked at him. Then come back with a recommendation for above the threshold. I wasn't sure if... Owen. She said it with the patience of someone who was going to say the thing once and expected it to land. I didn't hire you to manage within arbitrary limits. I hired you because you see things other people miss. If what you see requires resources above the threshold, tell me. That's the job. He looked at her for a moment. That's going to be an expensive conversation on a recurring basis. I've noticed that things that are expensive to fix correctly are more expensive when they're not fixed, she said. I have recent first-hand data on that. He wrote the recommendation. It was approved within 48 hours, which was faster than he'd expected, and which told him something about how seriously Serena was taking the gap between what she'd believed about the building's safety and what the building's safety actually was. He filed this information and kept working. The work itself was satisfying in a way that he noticed without overanalyzing. He had expected it to feel similar to the night shifts, the same building, the same corridors, the same fundamental attention to what was wrong and what needed fixing. It did, and it didn't. The attention was the same. The purpose of the attention was different, and the difference mattered in ways he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. When he'd been the night janitor, the attention was self-contained. He noticed things and cataloged them, and the catalog lived inside him without an obvious outlet. Now the catalog had somewhere to go. The noticing connected to the fixing, and the fixing connected to the system, and the system, gradually and imperfectly, began to take shape. Bridget noticed things he hadn't noticed, which he found genuinely useful, and said so directly, which seemed to surprise her the first time it happened. Most supervisors say good catch and move on, she said. I'm not most supervisors, he said. Yeah, I'm getting that. She paused. The air handling unit on 9 is going to be a problem in December. The thermal variance creates condensation near the electrical panel, and nobody's flagged it because it only happens in cold weather. Put it in the report, he said, with the timeline. Already did, she said. He found he liked working with people who had already done the thing before he said it. The Preston Vale trial began in February, 8 months after the arrest, and ran for 3 weeks. Serena attended every day she was required to, and some she wasn't. Owen attended once on a day when his own testimony was scheduled, a 40-minute session in which he described what he had observed in the sublevel corridor and the archive room in the specific factual language that left no room for interpretation and required very little from the prosecutor in the way of follow-up questions. Vale's defense attempted to characterize Owen's intervention as unauthorized and excessive. The prosecutor, a contained woman named Assistant DA Reyes, who Owen thought was very good at her job, asked Owen a single redirect question. Had he, at any point during his observation and subsequent action, had reason to believe that the intruder represented an ongoing threat? Owen said yes. He said why. He said it in 2 sentences. The defense did not ask further questions. Vale was convicted on 7 counts. The sentencing was 4 months later and produced a number that Serena received without visible satisfaction, which Owen understood. Satisfaction implied that the right outcome was the same as sufficient compensation for what had happened, and those were different things. Vale going to prison did not unbreak Chloe's arm or unestablish the 12 months of precaution and security reviews and changed routines that the Hawthorne family had lived through in the aftermath. It was what it was. It was the thing the system could do, and it did it, and life continued around it in the way life continued around verdicts, absorbing them, integrating them, moving forward with them as a fixed point in the past rather than an active pressure in the present. Chloe's cast came off in October, 6 weeks after the injury, exactly on schedule. She announced this to Owen the following Saturday morning when Owen and Mason were at the Hawthorne apartment for the second time that month, a frequency that had established itself gradually, without being formally arranged, the way certain things established themselves when 2 sets of people ran out of reasons to stay at a distance. Look, Chloe said, holding out her arm. Owen looked at it. Good range of motion? The doctor said full recovery. Does it hurt when you rotate it? Chloe rotated her wrist experimentally. A little, but I think that's normal. Give it another week before you go hard on it, he said. Don't rush the last 10%. I know, she said. My mom said the same thing. Your mom was right. Chloe accepted this with the equanimity of an 8-year-old who had recently updated her assessment of her mother and was now somewhat less surprised when Serena was right about things. The update had been happening gradually, in the way genuine updates happened. Not announced, not dramatic, just present in the changed texture of ordinary days. Serena was home at 6 now, or close to it. Serena was at the school events. Serena had, on 2 occasions that Chloe had mentioned to Owen with the careful casualness of a child who was watching for patterns, been at pickup when Chloe hadn't expected her. The unexpected pickups were the ones that mattered most. Chloe hadn't said this explicitly, but it was in the way she'd mentioned them. Mason was in the living room with an architecture book he'd found on Serena's shelf and appropriated without asking, which was the kind of thing Mason did when he was comfortable in a space. He had decided, in his particular 10-year-old way, that Serena's apartment was a place where he was allowed to be himself without managing it, and this decision had produced, over the weeks, a Mason who moved through the apartment with the comfortable territoriality of a kid who felt at home in a place that wasn't technically his home. Owen had noticed this. He hadn't said anything about it because there wasn't anything to say. It was simply what it was. His son finding the edges of a new space and deciding the space was safe, and the rightness or wrongness of it wasn't something he could determine in advance. He could only watch and stay honest with himself about what he was watching. He was doing a considerable amount of that, staying honest with himself. He and Serena had not talked directly about what was happening between them, which was itself a form of talking about it. The careful way they occupied the same spaces, the conversation that stopped and stopped again around the edge of something neither of them had named yet. He was aware of it. He suspected she was aware of it. They were both, he thought, people who had been burned by moving faster than the situation warranted in different ways and in different areas of life, and who had developed a corresponding caution that wasn't cowardice so much as respect for the cost of getting it wrong. The thing that was happening between them was not nothing. He knew that with the same clarity with which he knew most things he paid attention to. He had been paying attention to Serena Hawthorne for 8 months now, in meetings, in corridors, at taco places on Clement Street, at school pickups where she sometimes arrived in the line of parents with the slightly uncertain body language of a person still learning a routine that mattered to her. And what he knew was this: she was nothing like what he'd assumed and everything he'd observed. She was sharp and impatient and occasionally wrong and unwilling to admit it for approximately 45 minutes before admitting it directly and thoroughly, which was 40 minutes longer than ideal and 45 minutes faster than most people he knew. She was funny in the specific way of people who don't perform humor, who just say the true thing and let the truth be funny if it is. She was trying, visibly and imperfectly and without asking for credit for the trying, to be a different kind of mother than she had been, not reinventing herself, not performing transformation, just making a series of daily decisions that added up over 8 months to something Chloe could feel. He respected her. The respect had arrived before anything else, quietly and without announcement, and had then been joined by other things that he was being honest with himself about, even if he hadn't said any of them out loud. It was, he thought, a reasonable order for things to arrive in. The program's first anniversary fell on a Thursday in November, which was a cold, bright day that made the bay visible from most of the building's east-facing windows. Serena had insisted on a celebration that was not a gala. Owen had been clear that he would attend a reasonable acknowledgement and would not attend anything that required him to stand on a stage for more than 5 minutes and talk about himself. And Serena had agreed to this with the speed of a person who had already anticipated the objection and found it reasonable. It was a gathering then, the Veyron lobby after hours, the marble floors that Owen had mopped for 2 years before everything changed, with people from the program and people from the building and some people from the schools and community centers, where the safety training had expanded in the last 6 months. There was food, and there was noise, and there was Bridget explaining something technical about emergency response protocols to a group of people who were listening with genuine attention, which Owen found satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the fact that it was working. The program had reached 4 schools by the end of summer. By October, 3 community centers. The free first aid and emergency response training had been attended by, at last count, over 2,000 people. Not a huge number in the context of a city, but large enough to mean that in those specific neighborhoods, in those specific buildings, there were now dozens of people who knew what to do in the first 4 minutes before professional help arrived. And those 4 minutes were, Owen knew from experience, often the entire difference. He stood near the edge of the lobby with a glass of water. He didn't drink at work events, which this technically was, and watched it happen, and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a person looking at a thing they built and finding it functional rather than decorative. It was not a feeling he'd had often enough. He intended to keep doing the work that produced it. Chloe appeared at his elbow with the specific materialization of children who don't announce themselves because they've decided announcement is unnecessary. "Owen," she said. "Hey, Chloe. Can I tell you something?" He looked down at her. She had the serious expression she sometimes wore when she'd been thinking about a thing for a while and had decided it was time to say it. An expression that was startlingly similar to her mother's, which Owen had noticed and kept to himself. "Go ahead," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the marble floor. Then she said, "I remember something from that night, in the basement." He was still. "I don't remember a lot of it," she said. "Mom says that's normal, but I remember—" She stopped, collecting the thing. "I remember your voice before I knew who you were or what was happening or anything. You said—" She paused again. "You said I wasn't alone." Owen looked at her. "I didn't know if that was real," she said, "but it felt real. And when I woke up in the hospital and you were there, I thought, oh, it was real." He crouched down so he was at her level, which was something he'd started doing instinctively because it was how he talked to Mason when Mason was saying something that mattered. And Chloe, he had learned, said things that mattered with a frequency that required this posture on a regular basis. "It was real," he said. She nodded, like she'd confirmed something. "I wasn't actually scared," she said. "I mean, I was, but when I heard your voice, I wasn't. And then I couldn't hear it anymore for a while, and I was scared again." She looked at him directly. "I just wanted you to know that it helped." Owen looked at her for a moment. He thought about the corridor and the flashlight and the monitoring equipment and the particular way her pulse had felt under his fingers. Light, too light, and then steadying. He thought about the break room at 7:15 and the bad coffee and the fear moving through him like weather. "Thank you for telling me," he said. She nodded again, satisfied. Then she looked over his shoulder. "Mason is eating all the small sandwiches. He does that. Should someone stop him?" "Probably not," Owen said. "Pick your battles." She considered this with appropriate seriousness. "That's what Mom says." "Your mom is right more often than either of you probably admits." Chloe looked at him with the lateral assessment of a child who has just received information she intends to store for later use. "You like her," she said. Owen stood back up. "She's my employer." "That's not what I said." Chloe's expression was the patient expression of a person correcting a deflection they have identified as such. "You like her. I can tell because you look at her the same way you look at Mason when he doesn't know you're watching." Owen looked at this 8-year-old child and thought several things in fairly rapid succession, the first of which was that children who paid that quality of attention were both invaluable and occasionally inconvenient. "The sandwiches," he said. "I'll save you one," Chloe said, and disappeared back into the gathering with the efficiency of a small person who has completed her mission. He stood alone for a moment and breathed and looked at the marble floor that he knew the specific sound of at 2 a.m. in November, and thought about what Chloe had just said and whether it was the kind of thing he was going to keep filing in the back of his mind or the kind of thing that required a different response. He looked up and found Serena across the room. She was talking to someone from the school board with the specific half-attention of a person who is present in a conversation and also aware of a separate point of focus. Their eyes met across the gathering, briefly and without drama. The way eyes met when two people had spent enough time in the same rooms to have developed a peripheral awareness of each other's location. She looked at him for exactly a moment. Then she went back to the school board conversation. He thought, reasonable order. Oh. He found her later, when the gathering had thinned to the people who stayed to help clean up, and the people who were having one more conversation before they left. She was standing near the lobby's north window with a glass of wine she'd barely touched, looking out at the street below. And he came and stood beside her because the alternative was not standing beside her, and he had decided in the last hour that the alternative was no longer where he was. "Chloe told me something tonight," he said. She turned slightly. "About the sandwiches? Because I know about the sandwiches." "About the corridor," he said. "She said she remembered my voice before she knew who I was." Serena was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the window. "She told me that too. A few weeks ago." She paused. "She said it was the thing that made her hold on. The lobby noise continued around them, reduced but present. Voices, laughter, the sound of someone stacking chairs in the far corner. Owen looked at the street through the window, the November dark outside, the specific city light that had no equivalent anywhere else. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the corridor, in October, outside the school." "I said a lot of things in October." "You said you see me," he said, "that it was different from making me a project." She turned and looked at him directly. "It is different." "I know," he said. "That's the thing I've been thinking about." He paused. He was not generally a man who stumbled over words. He tended to say nothing until he had the words and then say them clearly. He was stumbling slightly now, which was itself information. "I've been doing what I do, paying attention. And what I've been paying attention to for 8 months is—" "Owen," she said. "I'm getting there," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying my name, so you know I'm here." He looked at her. The lobby light was the same pale, marble-reflected light it always was. The same light he'd mopped under for 2 years, and it looked different from here, from this side of things, standing next to her rather than moving past her. "I don't want to get this wrong," he said. "Neither do I. I'm not built for— I don't know how to do things halfway," he said. "I never have. So when I do something, I have to be sure it's the thing I mean to do." "I know that about you," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "I'm the same." She paused. "I'm also impatient, which you know, and occasionally wrong, which you also know. And I've spent 8 years making decisions at speed and learning which ones I should have slowed down for." She met his eyes. "This is one of the ones I should slow down for. But I want to be clear that I know where it's going." Owen looked at her for a long moment. "Chloe said I look at you the way I look at Mason when he doesn't know I'm watching." Serena blinked. Then something happened in her expression that was not quite a smile and was more than a smile. The thing beneath a smile, the real thing that smiles were sometimes built over when the real thing was too large to present directly. "She's 8, Serena said. "She's also correct," Owen said. The room continued around them. Carlos was laughing at something Bridget had said near the food table. Mason had apparently secured the remaining sandwiches and was in conversation with a woman from the community center who looked delighted by whatever he was explaining. The marble floor caught the light the way it always had. "Okay," Serena said. "Okay," he said. It was not, he thought, the most romantic exchange in the history of two people acknowledging something that had been building for 8 months. It was also exactly right. The right amount of words for the right moment, neither more nor less, which was how he preferred things, and which, he was learning, was also how she preferred things when she wasn't performing the version of herself that the executive role had trained her to perform. They stood at the window for a while after that, in a silence that was not uncomfortable, watching the street below and the gathering behind them, and the specific ordinary miracle of a Thursday night in November, when nothing was on fire and the people they were responsible for were safe and present and accounted for. The months that followed were not a smooth thing. He wanted to be clear about that, to himself, because he was a person who had learned that the versions of stories that made things smooth did damage by teaching people to expect smoothness, when what actually existed was something harder and more worth having. He and Serena argued in February about a decision she made regarding the program's expansion timeline without consulting him, which she had the authority to do, and which she acknowledged was the wrong way to handle it. The argument lasted 1.5 days and was not pleasant for anyone in its vicinity. It resolved because she apologized directly and he accepted directly, and they spent 2 hours rebuilding the expansion plan together with both of them at the table, which produced a better plan than either of them would have built alone, which was perhaps the actual point. Mason went through a period in the spring where he became difficult in the specific way that 10-year-olds becoming 11-year-olds became difficult, which was less about dramatic events and more about a sustained low-grade resistance to the shape of his own life that Owen recognized as legitimate and responded to by creating more space for Mason to say what was actually wrong, which took 3 weeks and several conversations, and eventually produced the information that Mason was struggling in math in a way he was embarrassed about and had been hiding, and that the struggle had been generating a general friction that had been mislabeled as attitude. Owen got him a tutor. Mason objected to the tutor for 2 weeks and then stopped objecting. By April, his math grade had moved from the place it had been to a place he could live with, and the general friction reduced. And Owen filed this under the ongoing education of understanding what Mason needed versus what Mason said he needed, which were not always the same thing. Chloe and Mason settled into a friendship that had the specific quality of siblings who did not share a household. Close when they were together, occasionally competitive, sometimes generous with each other, in ways that surprised the adults watching, and fundamentally comfortable in each other's presence, in the way that required no management or maintenance. Chloe taught Mason something about condensation. Mason taught Chloe the proper name for every part of Gerald, which she used with complete seriousness from that point forward. Serena made mistakes. Owen made mistakes. They were different categories of mistake, which was both a source of friction and eventually a source of something more useful. The specific knowledge of how the other person moved when things went wrong, what they needed when they were struggling, how to be useful rather than simply present in the difficult moments. He learned that Serena needed, when something was genuinely hard, to be allowed to be uncertain out loud without someone immediately trying to solve it. This was difficult for him because his instinct was always toward the practical response, toward the thing that could be done. He worked on it. He got better at it, imperfectly and over time. She learned that Owen needed, when he was carrying something, to not be asked about it directly, but to be given enough quiet space that he would eventually say it himself. Asking directly produced the controlled surface he'd spent 12 years perfecting. Patience produced the actual conversation. She was not by nature a patient person. She worked on it too. They built something together that neither of them had specifically planned, and both of them, in the way of people who have learned to pay attention to what is actually in front of them rather than what they expected to find, recognized as real and worth the work. They married the following October, which was 1 year and 11 months after an 8-year-old girl had been found in an underground corridor and her mother had run across a marble lobby in heels and grabbed a janitor's uniform with both hands. The ceremony was small. Owen had been clear about small, and Serena had agreed and then slightly pushed the definition of small by inviting 43 people, which Owen had looked at and said that is not small, and Serena had said it's small for me, and Owen had recognized this as the true statement it was and let it be 43. It was outdoors, which Serena had wanted and Owen hadn't objected to. The November weather cooperated imperfectly, which he had privately predicted. There was a period of about 20 minutes where it was genuinely cold and one of the guest chairs blew over, which Mason caught and righted with the casual efficiency of a kid who had grown up around a man who dealt with things as they presented themselves rather than waiting for more suitable conditions. Chloe stood beside her mother and Mason stood beside his father, which was where they had placed themselves without being arranged there. And Owen looked at this during the ceremony and felt the thing he'd felt in the hospital room when he'd watched Serena check the monitors and adjust the blanket with the automatic precision of a mother. The unnamed thing between relief and grief and something better than both. He knew its name now. He'd known it for a while. It was just belonging. The very ordinary and very hard-won fact of belonging somewhere, to something, to people who were his and whom he was. He had not expected to find it in a corporate building while pushing a mop. He had not expected to find it at all, if he was honest, because after his wife died there had been a long period where he'd stopped expecting things and started simply managing what was in front of him, and managing had worked well enough that he'd stopped examining the difference between it and living. Serena had disturbed that. He considered it one of the better disturbances of his life. At the reception, 43 people in a private room with food that was better than the taco place, but which Owen thought, and did not say, was not better by the margin the price difference would suggest. Mason gave a speech that he had written himself and not shown to Owen in advance, which Owen had not known was happening until Mason was standing with a piece of paper looking at the room with the slightly terrified face of a kid who had committed to doing something brave. The speech was 2 minutes long. It covered 3 things: that his dad was the best person he knew, that Serena made his dad laugh in a way Mason had not previously seen his dad laugh, and that Chloe had told him Gerald the boat had been renamed in Owen's honor, and he wanted to know if that meant he had naming rights over the next boat too. The room laughed. Owen looked at his son and thought, here, just here, the entire address. Here. Chloe spoke briefly too, which had also not been pre-announced. She said that she remembered being in the dark and not knowing if anyone was coming, and then hearing a voice tell her she wasn't alone, and that she had thought about that a lot in the following year, and that what she'd understood was that the most important thing anyone could do for another person was be there in the dark and tell the truth about it. She was 9 years old. Serena had her hand over her mouth for a moment, and then lowered it, and Owen looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. The program grew. By the second year, it had reached 16 schools, 7 community centers, and had trained over 8,000 people in emergency response, first aid, and the specific category of awareness that Owen thought of, not as vigilance, but as presence. The practice of being in the room you were actually in, attending to what was actually there, rather than the room you expected or the one you were planning for. He remained imperfect at his job, which was itself a form of competence. He hired a person who was better than him at institutional communication, which was a category of skill he had never pretended to excel at. He let Bridget lead the external training expansion because she was better at it than he was, and because recognizing that was not a failure, it was arithmetic. He continued to notice things that other people missed, and to say so directly, which remained occasionally inconvenient for everyone involved, including him. He went home at 3:15 on school days. He made breakfast on school mornings. He attended the concerts and the parent meetings and the math competitions that Mason had begun to have opinions about now that math had stopped being a source of friction. He was present in the way he had decided to be present, which was the only form of presence he'd ever known how to practice, completely, with attention, without performing it. Serena changed the things she'd said she'd changed, which took longer than she'd initially estimated, because changing actual patterns rather than intentions was a longer project than intentions suggested. She was at pickup more than not. She was home for dinner more than not. There were weeks when the company demanded more and she gave it more and came home late and Chloe was already asleep. And those weeks she sat with the specific discomfort of a person who has decided what they value and then failed to protect it, and she did not rationalize the failure or dismiss it or reframe it as inevitable. She sat with it and tried to do better the following week. Owen did not tell her it was okay when it wasn't. He also did not hold it against her, because holding things against people who were genuinely trying was a form of punishment that served no function he could identify. He told her, when she asked what he actually thought, which was that she was doing better than she'd done, and that doing better was the thing, not doing perfectly. She told him the same, on different occasions, about different failures of his. This was, he thought, probably what people meant when they said they'd found their person. Not someone who made the difficulty disappear, someone who made the difficulty worth the work. He had spent 2 years and 4 months invisible in a building, moving through the dark with a mop and a flashlight, and the particular attention of a man who had decided that showing up quietly and completely was the only form of showing up he could sustain. He had never thought of that as hiding, exactly, though Serena had called it that, and she had not been wrong. He had thought of it as the correct calibration for what the moment required. The moment being 8 years of being Mason's father, and Mason needing him to be present and consistent and alive. What he had not predicted was that the same qualities that made him invisible would be the ones that, in the right moment, in the right corridor, with the right person watching, made him visible in the way that mattered. Not to an audience, to a person. One person who grabbed his uniform with both hands and said, "Please save my daughter." And then, over 2 years of ordinary and imperfect days, said something he hadn't known he was waiting to hear. Not that he was extraordinary. Not that he was a hero or an asset or a resource someone had failed to notice. That she saw him, that she was paying attention now. He had spent a long time believing that was enough. Being seen by the person in the mirror, being known by his son, being present for the life he'd chosen. It was enough. He had not been wrong about that. But he was learning at 38 in a marble lobby with a November sky through the tall windows and 43 people eating food that was overpriced and a 9-year-old girl who had named a boat after his truck, that enough and all of it were different quantities, and that there was no rule saying you had to stop at enough if all of it was actually available. He had gone looking for nothing. He had found instead 4 people, 2 of whom called him Dad, and 2 of whom had come to mean something he hadn't budgeted for and had no interest in returning, and a building he still knew better than anyone, and work that mattered in the specific way that work mattered when it connected to something real, and mornings that started with breakfast, and evenings that ended with the particular quiet of a home where people were where they were supposed to be. The former Navy SEAL who had mopped floors in the dark for 2 years had not been waiting to be discovered. He had been doing the job in front of him, the way he always had, completely, without performance, with the attention that was the only thing he'd ever really had to give. It turned out that was the thing. It was always the thing. And in the end, what he received for saving a billionaire's daughter was not a reward or a title or a transformation into something he hadn't been before. It was something quieter and more durable than any of that. It was the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable fact of a life that was fully his. Not the one he'd set aside, not the one he'd lost, but the one that had been assembling itself piece by piece in the corridors and the break rooms and the school pickups and the taco places and the amber October afternoons, while he was busy paying attention to everything else. He paid attention to that too, now. He had learned not to overlook the things that were right in front of him.